Another macro large scale influence on divorce rates is women working. This may sound like kind of a harsh, unromantic way to put it, but for the most part, women no longer need men to support them financially as they did in the past. They're no longer as dependent on men financially as they were in the past, and thus they have more choice. You know, in my head, I hear that song, Sisters are doing it for themselves. And then I'll probably have that song stuck in my head for the rest of the day now. This is a very simple reason, a very obvious reason. I don't have to stay with you. We don't have to raise our children in this environment because I can look after myself. Maybe you have some older relatives that come to mind when I say this. I know I do. An aunt or grandmother or cousin that stayed married because they just didn't have the means to support themselves or their children on their own. So the more self-sufficient a woman is economically speaking, the more likely she is to end what she considered to be an unhappy marriage. Another macro large-scale influence on the incidence of divorce is sociocultural attitudes towards divorce. Does a society as a whole accept it? Or does a society as a whole consider people who are divorced as some kind of pariah, heavily stigmatized? Will the ex-husband or wife or both be socially excluded, considered less than others because they are divorced? This seems silly to us, living in a country where divorce is widely socially acceptable. But you know, even in advanced societies like ours, it was not always like that. And just because something is legal does not mean that it loses all stigma. In Great Britain in the 1950s, Queen Elizabeth's sister, Princess Margaret, wanted to marry a man who had been married previously and then divorced. Now, he had divorced because his wife had an affair. He was in no way at fault. Yet, the marriage was prohibited. In order to marry him, she had to give up her royal title and everything else. In the past, during election times in both Canada and the US, a candidate was not considered suitable unless they were married, and any hint of a possible separation or divorce would have sunk their chances at being elected. Divorce was considered a scandal, no matter the reason for it, a sign of people's inability to be responsible and work through problems like an adult. The stigma of a divorce was especially strongly attached to women, of course, because women were subject to harsher social judgment all around. Your text makes the point that a divorced woman, known as a divorcee in the past, had to deal with quite negative stereotypes because she was divorced. There was a perception that, if you're a divorced woman, you're living the high life, living on alimony. That she's always looking for a good time since she had previously been married, so it was like she wanted to break free from being trapped. And because she was previously married, she's no longer a virgin, so the perception was that a divorcee was more open to sexual activity. A divorcee would always be dressed well and smoke. In fact, they'd always portray them holding one of those cigarettes and one of those long holders. Why was this such a popular image? I don't know, it just was, and it was largely insulting. Now, both changes in divorce laws and sociocultural attitudes towards divorce, all of that contributes to the third main macro reason for divorce, which is cultural norms. Cultural norms are just that. They're the standards a society lives by. The shared and generally agreed upon expectations and rules of behavior that guide a society. It's now a cultural norm for women to work full-time even if married or they have children. It's a cultural norm in North America for women to have the same rights and responsibilities as men, to pursue an education in the same manner that men do. All of these cultural norms here influence societal perceptions of divorce here and of people who have been divorced. In other countries, it may be different. In other countries, their cultural norms do not provide widespread support for a marriage ending in divorce. And because of this, when it occurs, it is simply not socially accepted, which means it does not become an accepted cultural norm. And as a result, in other countries, the wife especially would be shamed and ostracized. Now, if we switch gears a bit and instead of large-scale macro influences on the divorce rate, think about smaller individual reasons for an increase or decrease in divorce rate, you'll notice that when we look at the smaller reasons, they really reinforce each other. Let's start with parental divorce. Yes, it is true. If your parents were divorced, you are much more likely to go through a divorce yourself. It's not a guarantee, it's a higher likelihood. My parents were not divorced, but I am. Same with my current partner. His parents were not divorced, but he is. The same with a lot of my generation who had parents for whom divorce was not an option. But we still ended up divorced ourselves. Why? I can't give you an exact reason. I can't just say that A leads to B and that's it. Socialization might have something to do with it, meaning that you have your parents' divorce as of an example of how to solve problems in a marriage, or you have your parents' marriage that ended in divorce as a model, albeit a poor one since they ended up divorced, of what marriage is supposed to be like, of how husbands and wives are supposed to talk to each other, of how they're supposed to do things. We also know, research has verified, that if your parents are divorced, then you're more likely to have particular difficulties yourself as a child, and then to continue having particular difficulties as an adult. But we're going to talk about that later on when I focus on kids specifically. Things like marrying at a younger age, being more likely to have a child out of wedlock, as well as others. Divorce rates are also influenced by childbearing. Specifically, if a couple has children or not, because those without kids are more likely to end up divorced. And I got to tell you, while I don't agree with this, research is research and facts are facts. I get that. But I admit this gets under my skin a bit because I personally believe you don't need to have children in order to have a fulfilling life. You know, I think I said in a previous lecture, I referred to a friend of mine who strongly believes that if a person does not want children, that is abnormal. And I think I told you how I've tried to explain to this person over and over and over in various ways that it's a personal choice. So knowing that couples without children are more likely to divorce, I think is a little fact I'll keep to myself instead of sharing it with my friend. As you might expect, again, all of these reasons are going to run into each other. Now, something that might surprise you that you might not necessarily think of as contributing to divorce rates is how similar spouses are. But when you think about it, it really does make total sense. If you are the same religion or have similar religious views, the same general socioeconomic status, roughly the same level of education, similar background experiences, similar attitudes towards money and a division of household labor, if you're of a similar race and ethnicity and thus a similar culture. As simple as it sounds, there will be fewer things to have disagreements about. I'll give you a personal example of this, which is kind of funny. My partner the last 7 years is French and Italian. Really French and Italian. Meaning his mom was raised in Italy in a small town in a house that didn't even have running water, just like in the beginning of The Godfather Part 2. So a very, very old-fashioned, stereotypically Italian upbringing. And it's not a stereotype that many Italians tend to be loud when they talk, to be very demonstrative and use their hands a lot and raise their voices and use a lot of dramatic inflection, which is very different from my English as an England background. Our basic communication styles were very different based on our culture and our upbringing. And because of this, we had disagreements until he realized I wasn't raised to communicate that way as the norm. And then I had to realize it's not that he was being an idiot. For him, that was a normal method of expressing himself. So we laugh about it now. But if we hadn't figured it out and been open to figuring it out, it would have been the end of the relationship. You know, the first time I spent time with his extended Italian family, we got into his vehicle and he looked at me and said, "So, what do you think?" And I said, "I need some Tylenol," partly because everybody was so bloody loud and partly because your uncle kept refilling my wine glass. So, on a logical level, a rational level, of course, if two people are dissimilar, it will mean more potential issues in their relationship. Opposites may attract, but opposites rarely stay together, despite what you may see in the movies. So I'm still focused on smaller influences here that affect the divorce rate. And a recognized micro contributor to divorce rates is age at marriage. If you marry young, you are more likely to end up divorced. Okay, so what's considered marrying young? Right now in Canada, the average age at first marriage for a woman is 27 and for a man is 29. Really, it's marrying before age 25, and especially marrying as a teen. Those are big red flags increasing the likelihood of divorce, which I think is pretty well recognized and not surprising. You know, marrying young means marrying before each person is finished developing. Adolescence doesn't end at 18. Adolescence runs right into the early 20s for most people. You're not just automatically an adult on your 18th birthday or your 20th birthday, socially speaking. Tied to young age at marriage, because this is more likely, is non-marital childbearing, having a baby before being married. This is tied to a young age at marriage because having a baby is a common reason why very young people get married. Having a child before being married increases the risk of divorce for two main reasons. The most obvious being, would they even have decided to get married if not for the child? And the answer in many of those cases is no. But in addition, when a young couple has a child, getting married is often considered something that will help to solidify their relationship. It's thought to kind of solidify the father's involvement with the baby, and it's considered something that will provide the child a more stable family environment, which it rarely does. And added to this, having a kid, especially at a young age, is stressful. So you're trying to adjust to a marriage at the same time as you have an infant. It's like a double whammy. Until you've actually gone through sleep deprivation for several months at a stretch, you have no idea how much of a negative effect that can have on a person. And then you've got two people who are sleep deprived with the enormous responsibility of looking after a little baby. So yes, of course, childbearing is going to influence divorce rates. Tied to a younger age at marriage and having a child before marriage is a lower level of education as a contributor to divorce rates. If a couple have a child before being married, they are less likely to have completed their education or to have gained a higher level of education. If a couple marry at a younger age, they are less likely to have completed their education or to have gained a higher education. And people with lower levels of education are more likely to end up in a lower socioeconomic status and thus more likely to be divorced. So this all runs together, doesn't it? It's like one thing bleeds into the other. And then tied to a young age at marriage and having a child before marriage and a lower level of education is, as I just said, a lower income. Couples with a lower income are more likely to end up divorced. Financial worries cause stress. They cause anxiety, and this will increase the likelihood of conflict in a marriage. You know, in all the research about divorce, when investigating what couples are most likely to have disagreements about or arguments about, the number one reason given is usually money. So it should be no surprise that a couple with a lower socioeconomic status is going to have an increased chance of not staying together. So it really is a cycle, isn't it, in many situations? For some couples who create a situation in which they have all of these risk factors, but it's hard for them to see the forest for the trees. You can explain it to them, lay it all out, but they insist they will be the couple that are the exception that will stay married. They're going to make it. Even though the people around them know that realistically, there are very few reasons to be optimistic. So let's keep moving ahead, looking at what effect divorce has on the people involved. And first, I want to point something out. I want you to take a slightly different perspective of divorce and realize something. Marital breakdown and divorce are separate processes. They are separate things. The deterioration of a relationship is one thing. That's different from a separation. And a separation is different from a divorce. And each of these requires a different kind of process to go through them. When a relationship breaks down, that is an emotional process, a social process. You can have a friendship deteriorate, a dating relationship ends, even a seriously committed personal relationship. When these end, it's emotional, but they very rarely require a large social adjustment regarding your personal identity. And they certainly don't require any kind of legal intervention. So it might require a small social adjustment in terms of people being aware of the change. But, keeping life in perspective, it's not huge, even though it might feel that way at the time. When a marital separation occurs, that implies a couple who is at least living together, have decided for whatever reason to live apart. This is also an emotional process, and it's much more of a social process requiring a personal and public social adjustment. So with a separation, unlike a relationship just ending, it is much more likely to have that added dimension of needing to adjust your social identity as well. It is a social process. You were a public couple with a certain level of public commitment, and that has changed. Or you're living with somebody and then you're not living with them. So you were recognized by society as a much more permanent couple than one that's just dating, and now that has ended. When a divorce occurs, that has the emotional component, and it has the social component, and it has a legal component. Many would argue much more of a social component than just a separation between two people living together, because it involves legal issues. If a divorce occurs, that indicates that the couple were legally married, that they were recognized by the government and the legal system as a legally married couple. They signed a marriage certificate, which is a legally binding contract, which still receives more social recognition in our society than living common law. And because of this legally recognized contract, many would argue there's more of a social adjustment with a divorce instead of a separation. And then in addition, the couple needs to legally end the marriage contract. A divorce is a legal process, which is something different. To quote your text, divorce is a process that is rarely quick or easy. You said it. Talk about an understatement. Even if you have absolutely no doubt you're making the right decision, even if you feel 100% sure that you've done everything in your power to make the marriage work, and thus can end it with no regrets or no thoughts about, what if we tried this or what if we did that? A divorce is still difficult, emotional, and often stressful and upsetting. And then add in any issues regarding children on top of that and the financial issues. This will be even worse for couples who are not sure of their decision to file for divorce, and that's about 25% of couples. You know, in the last lecture, I talked about intimate partner violence, and I pointed out that one of the reasons commonly cited for a person to stay in a violent relationship is that they cling to the hope that their partner will change, that their relationship can go back to the way it was in the beginning, that things will get better. It's not uncommon to have those feelings for a married couple going through a divorce without any violence at all. It used to work. Why can't we get back there? Maybe you know of couples that just keep limping along with the relationship because they just can't let go of that hope that things will improve, even though it's very clear that they won't. Now, one of the points I've made, and that your text makes, is that deciding to end a marriage is not a quick decision. No matter what's going on, even if something that occurs is really negative. Referring again to the previous lecture about intimate partner violence, I think I pointed out that when somebody's in a serious relationship, much less a serious one that is also legal like a marriage, very few people bail at the first sign of trouble. This is what people who stay in an abusive relationship often say. I'm committed to them. I'm committed to the relationship. I don't want to just give up. And this is also what married couples often say, even without intimate partner violence. And it's true. Very few people would just ditch and divorce at the first sign of trouble, whether that's disagreements about finances, feeling unappreciated, feeling unwanted, whatever it is. I don't mean like, the hokey, oh, I do anything for love. I mean, most try to figure things out because of what they've already invested in the relationship. Time, effort, emotion, feeling. Both the extended families have connected. Yes, money, all of that. Instead, the vast majority try to work things out, and they'll try more than once. And because of that, ending a marriage is rarely a quick process. It is very rarely a quick decision, and that's it, and then you get the legalities of the divorce out of the way. No, divorce is highly emotional. Even if both spouses agree that divorce is the best option. It's usually initiated by one spouse. It's not an overnight decision. Yes, people will say things in the heat of the moment when they're having a disagreement. That's not unusual. They may even start to pack up some clothes or whatever. They may start seriously thinking about where they would live and the practical considerations that they have to figure out. But very, very few make a rash decision and then stick to it. Divorce is emotionally expensive because there's so much emotion tied up in getting married and having children and truly planning in every way to have a life with somebody. But then, for whatever reason, that imagined life is sidetracked. And again, even when you're 100% sure it's the right thing to do, it can be very emotionally taxing. And then on top of all that emotion, you've got the cost. In settling a divorce, it's common to have disputes about who owns what, who should keep what something is worth, who gets the snowblower, who gets the lawn furniture or other property acquired during a marriage. Thousands of this kind of dispute pass through the lawyers' offices and courts every year. All of a sudden, excuse me, that 10-year-old sectional couch in the rec room becomes the focus of legal litigation that ends up costing more than the couch was worth brand new. In my head, I can hear a fictional person saying, "I'll be damned if they get that couch over my dead body." I teach a third-year course every couple years called Collective Behavior, which includes studying trends and fads. And in that course, at some point, I talk about different toy trends, including Beanie Babies. In the class, I include a picture of a couple in a courtroom going through a divorce, dividing their Beanie Baby collection as part of their divorce settlement. Could you imagine that? Generally speaking, the more disagreements a couple ending their marriage have, the more expensive it is for two reasons. First, the obvious. More disagreements mean the divorce will take longer, more time with a lawyer if you're using one, and lawyers commonly charge at least, as a minimum, $250 an hour. More time spent in court, and lawyers often charge a higher rate for litigation, and thus higher legal bills. But there's another reason why divorce is expensive. Something very few acknowledge in the moment is that the more conflicts there are, the longer a divorce takes. And the longer it takes, that means the longer before both can move on as single people, not just emotionally, but financially as well. The longer your finances are still tangled up together, the longer it is before you can make concrete financial plans of your own. So it's like you're in financial limbo. Usually, even though this is not what we see on TV, most couples are able to work things out. But as you can see here, these are the average cost of a divorce if it's uncontested, meaning if couples can agree on things, compared to if it is contested. And these are average costs in Ontario. Lawyer, $250. I don't even think you can get a lawyer in North Bay for $250 an hour anymore. $300 is typical, and that's still a much lower rate than many charge. Usually, a woman's economic position still tends to decline after a divorce, while a man's rises or at least does not decline. And I don't want that to be a, oh, men suck and they take advantage conversation, because that's not what that is at all. There's no mystery why the economic position of women tends to decline after a divorce quite easily, even if legally women are in a better position than in the past. So I'm going to give you an example of a past case. There are certain cases of divorce that occur that end up affecting the rest of society and end up becoming a catalyst for encouraging something about society to change. This occurred in Canada with Irene Murdoch when she and her husband divorced. This occurred in 1968 in Canada. The Murdochs had been farmers, and when they separated, Irene claimed half the family cattle ranch because for 25 years, she had worked the 480-acre ranch alongside her husband. In fact, for 5 months every year, her husband would work elsewhere, and during that 5 months, she kept it running herself. And she said, quote, "I would do the haying, stacking, sweeping, running to town for repairs, and gas and oil. I just thought when you went into a marriage, it was a partnership basis, 50-50. That's what she thought. She was denied by the court. Instead, it was ruled it was her husband's farm and she was not entitled to any of it. In fact, the judge said that she had done the work of, quote, any ranch wife, end quote, and that this routine of work that she did not justify a share in the property. Instead, eventually she was awarded $200 a month in support. Well, she appealed it. In 1973, the Supreme Court of Canada heard the case on appeal, and it also denied her a share on the grounds that her contribution was no more than that of any other wife, and that it did not create any interest in the lands. And she was even ordered to pay a portion of her husband's legal costs, although he did not go after her for it. Now, a later ruling gave her a lump sum settlement of $65,000, but that also ceased the monthly payments. Until this case with Irene Murdoch, a woman going through a divorce wasn't entitled to any equity built up over the life of the marriage if she hadn't financially contributed to the purchase of the property. But after it, public outcry resulted in matrimonial property laws being enacted by the provinces, making property acquired after a marriage the joint holdings of a husband and wife. So Murdoch versus Murdoch goes back a bit in time, but it's still relevant because it demonstrates how, historically speaking, women really were in a sorry state in the event of a divorce. It also demonstrates how, as is true for any divorce, although it can be an intensely private matter, it's also subject to public law. So it's this intensely private issue, but it's governed and controlled by public laws. It's regulated by wider society. Divorces regularly, not always, but regularly, require the intervention of the legal system because the soon-to-be ex-husband and wife simply cannot or will not work out the particulars and the details of their divorce on their own. Yes, it is possible to be divorced without a lawyer. It's very easy. But it requires both spouses to agree on everything. And this often does not occur, which thus requires legal intervention, which is time-consuming and expensive and causes further emotional turmoil for everybody involved, including those not party to the divorce itself, such as children.